Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you this morning. There we go. Turn your Bibles over to Matthew 13. That's where we'll get started here in just a bit. Matthew chapter 13. Again, we're really thankful that you've decided to have us out, and it's nice to be able to spend time with you and David and Bailey also. David's attitude I've always really appreciated for all sorts of different things. And from when he was in the training program, I came to visit and he was working in the office there with Brent, there was a thought that I had where I was like, I don't even know why he's here like doing this stuff. He's already got so much nailed out and thinks so well about things. And so I'm glad he's working here with you all and that you're being able to learn and work together and to grow that way. A little refresher for what we talked about last night. Again, also thank you so much for being out here, especially so late. And I know several of you had multiple hour drives to get home. And we did cover a lot of stuff last night. So we first talked about Jesus' purpose and how he had told both his disciples and Pilate that it was his purpose that he had come to establish his kingdom. And this wasn't a thing flouted by mankind or delayed or anything like that, but he came in his power and his glory to do exactly what he said his purpose was to do. And so God did not fall short there, but had established his kingdom. And we saw in the next lesson how Isaiah prophesied of those things 700 years before Jesus was on the scene and prophesied what that kingdom would look like. It would come from a king from the line of David. It would be an everlasting kingdom. It would be an otherworldly kingdom. It would overthrow all oppressors, and it would be filled with people who were holy, that would dwell in God's presence just as he is holy. So we talked about that last night and had looked at a lot. I've let David know, I've left notes here too. If you want to look through all those scriptures and have those again, you can make copies of those. And we have recordings except for the last one. That was my fault. So we're going to go ahead and pick up in our series this morning. And really, this is kind of an overarching story as we go through most of the scriptures on this idea. And so we've talked about Jesus' purpose, and we've kind of, like, some of your movies that you'll see, we kind of started at the end almost. And so then we went back to closer to the beginning with Isaiah to look through the prophecies. Now we're going to go back to Jesus' time and look at some of the things that he taught. And we're going to kind of follow that idea as we go through the rest of these series. We'll be in one place, we'll move forward, we'll go back, and so on and so forth. So we're going to be in Matthew 13 to begin, of course, talking about the kingdom. And we're going to be looking at Jesus' parables especially. Now, I like the parables, and they're very interesting to us just as humans. We are storytellers. We have, grown up around campfires and around dinner tables telling stories to one another. And so the parables, I think, really tap into that very basic human idea of us communicating stories to people and then really having kind of a moral to that story as well. And so Jesus really speaks to me, and I think a lot of other people in the world, when he brings up these parables. But I wonder if you know why Jesus would bring up these things and why he would present them as parables. And I wondered this for a long time, because to the average, kind of common listening person that would listen to Jesus' sermons, he only spoke to them in parables. So look in Matthew 13 and verses 10 through 17. And this is very strange to me, because you and I, when we're reading the scriptures, we're getting kind of to see behind the curtain a little bit. And we're seeing not only Jesus' conversations with just the thousands of people who have come to listen to him, but we're getting to see some of those private conversations with just the 12 disciples. And not all of them heard the same things between one another. So here in Matthew 13 and in chapter 13, verse 10, Jesus is just talking to his disciples, just those few that he himself had chosen, and he explains why the parables are a tool that he's using for them. There in verse 10 it says, "The disciples came and said to him, 'Why do you speak to them in parables?' Jesus answered them, 'To you it has been granted to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been granted. For whoever has, to him more shall be given, and he who will have in abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing they do not see, and while hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, "You will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull, and their ears they scarcely hear. And they have closed their eyes, otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them.'" But Jesus, after quoting that, says, "Blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it." And so this is interesting to me because sometimes I figure, well, Jesus just talked about all of the stuff in the Gospels with just everybody that he came across. And that's not the case. In most cases and in most times and places and people, he just would convey a parable to them, not give the explanation, and just let them think about that for a while. And I wonder, why is he doing this? Well, he explains here a little bit as well, but one of the things that he's trying to accomplish in presenting these parables is to not just tell people the answer and have them go, okay, yeah, whatever, and their eyes still be closed. He's trying to get them to see it for themselves. And when you and I see stuff for ourselves and discover it for the first time on our own, it really makes a greater impact. And so he's trying to get people not to bring the kingdom to them, but to get them to come to the kingdom. And so as in this stream of thought then, he presents three different types of parables. And so we'll break these three down, and we'll actually give you a little bit of a snippet before we go. The three types of parables are wisdom parables, worker parables, and wedding parables. And they all convey different ideas, but the worker parable, or rather the wisdom parables, are trying to train the listeners to recognize the kingdom when they see it. So the kingdom will appear, and we talked about Isaiah, there's all these weird images and all these different sort of analogies and metaphors that can talk about the kingdom, but when you see it in reality, or at least in the temporal sense, the meat and bone sort of sense, it would look very different than what they were anticipating. So the parables about wisdom are trying to get them to see it when it comes. Then there are the worker parables, which are teaching them to try and anticipate the kingdom. Or in other words, the parables here that Jesus speaks, the ones we'll be studying about especially, are especially given to the people who are listening to Jesus at that time. So you and I will get a secondary application from it. You might learn some of the good lesson and moral from the story, I guess. But the first impact, the first application is especially for those people then at that time. So we're kind of gleaning some side information from this. But he's teaching people at that time, which remember last night he said that there are going to still be people alive that time who would see the kingdom coming. He's teaching them to not only recognize it, but get ready for it and anticipate it so that when it does come, they enter right in. Then there are the last type of parables, which are the wedding parables, which are teaching them to prepare for the kingdom. So they get to see it when it comes, they're waiting for it, and now they're working, in a sense, to prepare themselves for it. And so that's the three ideas that we'll go through our lesson this morning. Let's go ahead and start off with the wisdom parables. And for that, we'll stay in this chapter in Matthew, and we'll go down a few verses to verse 44 through 46. And there's several different parables here. Some of them talk about some different things, but we'll kind of keep the ones here that have this main running theme. We won't talk about the parable of the dragnet, though that's very, very interesting. But we'll start here with the parable of the hidden treasure in verse 44. Now, as we get ready to read this, and you'll notice it right off the bat, all of the parables begin with some reference to the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, there are a couple that don't have that right there at the beginning. Sometimes they'll have it at the end. But there's a very few, there's like 2 or 3 that don't have a mention of the kingdom of heaven at all. But just because of what we read there earlier on in chapter 13, whether it's explicitly stated or implicitly supplied, all of these parables are talking about the kingdom of heaven. They are all designed to illustrate what it's going to look like. So let's go ahead and start there with that idea. In verse 44, we see the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again, and for joy over it he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls, and upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. These 2 parables are very simple, and they really talk about the same thing, but they address that same thing from different perspectives. And so no matter who you are in this room, as we are learning secondary things from this, secondary applications, you are here in one of these few verses. For instance, look at verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like that hidden treasure. So a person goes, he's working in a field. He's not looking for treasure in a field. That's the last place that you would look for something, like pirate treasure, right? And so he's just there to work the field, get some food, but also work for the person who owns the field. So he's going to bring the produce in. That person's going to make a profit on it, and he'll be able to live probably with the person who owns the field, get some food, maybe a little pay, and just kind of do life as usual. And so he's just doing his job, and he stumbles across this. He wasn't looking for it. But when he found what it was and he understood its value, it says that he went and sold every single thing that he had, and he bought that field. Now, maybe this is you. And maybe when you found Christ to begin with, it was just a complete accident. You stumbled upon him, as it were. Maybe that's you. Or maybe you're verses 45 through 46, where there was a person who was in the business of trying to find very expensive things. He was looking for it everywhere he could. And so as he looks around trying to find fine pearls, he finds the big one. And then he sells everything that he has to get it. He's in the business of finding expensive things. And so you're probably one of those two. I think there's only the two types of people in the world, the people who stumble upon it and the people who are looking for it. And so think about that for a moment, but also consider how the people would be listening to this as Jesus is presenting this parable and then the moral of the story. As we get ready to go through some of these more parables and these as well, I want you to notice a few things that are germane to all parables, things that are fundamental and you'll find in every single parable. And that is that the parables always convey a story that has elements that are normal in life, things that you would have experienced on an everyday sort of basis. And so they're very relatable and understandable. Now, for you and I, we don't live so much in an agrarian society anymore, but there's still so many things about the parables that we just get. And that's how they're designed. They're really kind of timeless. So they're going to have an element that is germane, though probably not always an actual factual account. But then they're also going to have, of course, a moral to the story with a reference to the kingdom of heaven. So you'll see that every time. Now, one of the things I want to talk about here for this treasure, searched for or found, is we're going to learn some secondary application from this again. And let's consider how it is that when we stumble upon the kingdom of heaven, and it already exists. It has been existing for a while in the temporal sense, in the chronological time sense. Jesus came 2,000 years ago almost, and the kingdom's been going since then. We'll talk a little more about that as we go. But as you're coming to the kingdom and you stumble upon it, or you were looking for it that whole time, notice the thing that's necessary for those who discover it. So you found it, or you searched for it. The people who eventually find it need to sell everything. I want you to think about the things that you own and the things that you possess. And I'm not just talking about material stuff, but include that too. You own things, stuff. You own ideas and concepts handed down from your parents and from people that you know. You own philosophies. You own your identity. You own a whole lot of things beyond just the material, though that's a portion of it as well. And you've probably heard the phrase about how it's always a bad idea to go up against somebody who has nothing to lose. And if you think about that for a second, we all have something to lose. So we all drove here in cars for the most part, right? Or got a ride in a car. And so as you traveled here by whatever means it was, and you have this possession, which a car is very useful to get to work, to get to hobbies, and so on and so forth, cars go bad all the time, right? And they break down. And sometimes we were talking with Bailey, she suffered a car fire on her way to school once. And so all of her possessions moving to college were in that car. And all that stuff burns down or goes away or breaks down or gets wrecked or whatever. And you've lost something very important to you. But I think for the most part, we all look at that and we go, you know what? It's just a car. I can get a new car. I can ride the bus. I can get a ride with a friend, whatever. It's just a car. But then you think, well, at least I have a place to stay at night. That'll work. But then what happens when you lose that? There's another preacher that David and I both know who also trained with the same person we trained with, and he and his family's house burned down once while they were going to worship. While they were at worship with all the brethren, their house was in flames and they came back to ashes. And you go and you look at that and it's like, all the pictures of my childhood and all the things that we made memories with together are all gone. But at least I got my family. But family's not always healthy all the time. And sometimes you lose family. And there's many of you who've lost all of your family. And then you say, well, at least I've got my memories of them. But then memories fade. And we get older, and the things that we used to hold on to, we can't quite remember how it went. And when you lose all of those things, you say, well, maybe at least I have my health. And we know that that's fleeting too. And then what else do you have? Well, you have your life. but we're fragile. So what do we have? And if we say we're going to fight as people who have nothing to lose, we've got a lot to lose. So notice what Jesus says to these people who either search for or stumble upon this treasure. When we talk about cars getting wrecked and houses burning down and memory fading and things like that, those things we say are kind of taken from us. In fact, we'll say that sometimes about our family that we've lost, that they've been taken from us early. We'll use that same type of figure of speech. But what about these people here? That stuff that they had, those possessions that they owned, that was not taken from them. They willingly gave it away. And there's something that's a lot easier about this. You know that when something's taken away from you, whether it's family or possessions or whatever, that is a hard thing and it takes some time to get over. But the things that you look at and you go, I will give this away. That is so simpler and so much easier of a thing. It's still hard, but it's so much easier. I remember when I was moving once as a kid, my mom said, okay, you got to pack up your room because we're getting ready to move. And, you've got to have everything in boxes or else we're leaving it behind. And I was going really slow. I liked a lot of these things and I didn't want to give things away. And so my mom brought somebody in from church and this lady came in to my room and she just started going through my stuff and she's like, this is trash. And I'm like, what are you doing? And it's so much harder when she just comes in and takes away your stuff as opposed to if I had got my act together and had made the decision to get rid of the things that were not necessary. That's what Jesus is asking people to do. In fact, he becomes a little more pointed later on. If you go over to Matthew chapter 19, you know this account. Matthew chapter 19, and we'll start in verse 20. This is a person who has the stuff and who is told what it takes to get the treasure and realized, honestly so, that was too costly. It was too much to give up. And Jesus isn't going to take it from him. He's going to make that decision for himself. Thus the parables. He has to come to it himself. And so, as we talk about what we have, let's look at what this person has here in verse 20 of chapter 19. The rich young ruler, the young man said to him, all these things that you've asked me to do, right? To not commit adultery, not murder, not lie, all these different things here. I've done all of that stuff. He says, all these things I have kept. What am I still lacking concerning entrance into eternal life? Jesus says to him in verse 21, if you wish to be complete. Your translation might say perfect, and the idea is of maturity. If you wish to be a full-grown, fully developed person within God's kingdom, here's what you need to do. Go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. Now, Jesus had just before this reading and just said, follow the law. That's what God has asked, especially as he's talking to a Jewish person. The law is their covenant. It's their agreement with God. So that's what you do. And the strange thing is that he thinks that that's not enough, that agreement that God has made with man. He thinks it's too small of a thing. So what more do you need me to do? Surely there must be more than that. And he seems to be going kind of above and beyond what God has asked of people. But Jesus says, okay, you want to do something else. Get rid of the thing that you don't want to get rid of. He has and is defined by, his identity is wrapped up in, we always call him the rich young ruler. And he doesn't have a name to us because he's defined by these things. Now he gives him a choice though, and it's a choice that he could make. It's not impossible. In verse 22 it says, but when the young man heard this statement, he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. Now, Jesus says to his disciples, and another gospel account says that Jesus had compassion on him as he went away. And I imagine him kind of almost like in pity and in a bit of sadness, looking back to his disciples as they continue to travel down the road and say, truly I say to you, as the man's walking the other way, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I say to you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they were astonished and said, then who can be saved? Now, notice this, right? In verse 25, I typically, when I was younger, used to think of the disciples as just a bunch of poor folks. And it's like, well, this is the only thing we've got going for us is to follow this teacher. So let's go ahead and do this. But I'm reminded that Peter, at least, we'll just talk about him for a second, is a fairly wealthy individual. He owns a business in a place where it's hard to come by your own business. And not only that, but he owns a fleet of boats. And his friends come and help him out with this. And so I'm sure that they have some deals worked out as far as what their pay is concerned. Peter's a fairly wealthy person. Peter is, in a sense of speaking, if we kind of equate the time and inflation and all of this, he's wealthier than I am. And he is very much so astonished. He says, who can be saved if rich people can't get into the kingdom of heaven? But then again, I say, I'm tempted, and we're tempted to do this all the time. Well, Peter's richer than I am. Of course, he's astonished, but we've all got something to lose. We're all rich in some way. Jesus looks at him, and I imagine, and this is complete supposition, just take this for what it is. This is just David's idea of things. But I imagine he looks at him kind of like a wink. Like, you're getting it now. It's impossible for rich people to enter the kingdom of heaven. Who then can get in? Verse 26, he says, looking at Jesus, and looking at them, Jesus said to them, with people, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. It's impossible for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And a rich person is not the person who has one more zero in their bank account than you do. The rich person is the one who has anything to lose. Anything that they hold on to that they count as valuable. So what do we do with what we have? What do we do with for the real treasure? And again, what you have, you might say, wait a second, David, I live in like a 400 square foot apartment and I don't have a car and I don't have enough stuff. I barely have a stove to cook my own food on. And you're saying that I'm a rich person? Yes. Because there's so much to you, so much more to you than the stuff that you possess. And if you are a rich person, what would you do for the real treasure? What thing would you willingly give away for that? And again, there might be people who might have like a spare house to give away. But you might have an ideology, a philosophy, something that has defined you in your past, a memory that makes you you. It's still something you possess, something that's valuable to you. Rich people can't enter the kingdom of heaven. But earlier on in the Gospels, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3, Jesus says that only poor people can. Matthew 5 and verse 3 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the kingdom of God." Only poor people, in other words, only those who have given all, given everything, enter into the kingdom. Let's go back to Matthew 13 and pick up where we left off. Matthew chapter 13, and let's skip down to verse 51. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 51. Jesus gives another parable in the meantime. We won't discuss that this morning. But we'll go down to the finish of this particular context. After this, Jesus moves on to another place. There's more people to teach, more parables to talk about. And in verse 51, it says there, as he speaks to those who he's told these parables to, he says, "Have you understood all these things?" And I want to ask you that question. Does this make sense to you? Do you understand what it means that a person went and sold everything that he had to get that pearl or get that field with that treasure contained therein? Do you understand what that means? They responded to him, yes. In verse 52, he says, and Jesus says to them, "Therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven or a student of the kingdom of heaven is like the head of a household who brings out of his treasure things new and things old." Now, this is a little bit weird too. Do you understand these things? Yes. Okay, let me give you something else to kind of chew on and try and understand as well. Jesus says about a scribe. Now, remember, the scribes at this time were people who were going to go through the law. I like to describe them this way. They were the Xerox copy machines of the ancient times. So they go through the law and they were charged with copying those older scrolls to newer scrolls so that they could have the law as it was originally written. Now, they were so fastidious about this that if they messed up, like if there there was a typo on that, the whole scroll was trash and to be removed. And there's a whole lot of other quirks and traits that they had, but they were very serious about taking God's word, remembering it, conveying it, repeating it, and making sure it was well established for all the people to read. And so the people who go to God's word, he says, the scribes who are spending all their time in what God has given through Moses, he says they then become disciples or students of the kingdom of heaven. And if they are a student and they're learning and they're doing what the teacher has asked, they become somebody entirely different. These are people who have sold everything when they find that pearl of great price, of which the kingdom of heaven is concerned, and they become a head of a household. Now look at this. We've seen here in verses 44 through 46 that these are people who counted the things that they owned as loss to get the greatest gain. And as they sold everything and became the poorest people on the face of the earth, they gained then everything back. And then they became like heads of households. Now look at it again in verse 52. It says that they come and they bring out treasures, things old and things new. When I was a kid, I had turned 12, and we had just moved into a new place up in the mountains, and it was just really a neat place, and my grandparents were already living up there, and so we moved up to be closer to them. And I remember on my 12th birthday that we kind of had almost like a rite of passage sort of ceremony. Like my dad and my grandpa both had something to give me. And my dad gave me a brand new pellet gun so I could go out and start shooting cans and squirrels and things like that. And then my grandpa gave me his old buck knife, his old little folding knife that was, it had a wood handle and everything, and it had seen years of use, but he kept it so sharp and nice and clean, and he polished the brass on the ends. And these were the heads of my household, my fathers before me. And they had given me these riches, this wealth, these wonderful things that I treasured for so long. And I hope that, as I get older, I might have an opportunity to do that for my kids and you for your kids, that you are able to convey to them either this great teaching and truth that you had learned or some item that had meant a lot to you. And really there's a neat moment that occurs in that. And if you are the person who sold everything to get the greatest good, you're the richest head of the household that there is. And then you can freely give that to your descendants and the people that you're around. And you become the most generous person that the world has ever seen. And it really comes from you having learned what it means to give everything away. And so he says here, you become like a head of a household who already sold his treasure, but brings out new treasure, things old and things new. As Jesus continues through the rest of the parables, we get to see that there are people throughout time, even as you move away from the Gospels and into Acts. Acts chapter 4 and verse 32, for instance, says that all the people, all the disciples of the kingdom of heaven through Christ, counted nothing as their own, but shared everything in common because they didn't possess anything anymore. They found the real treasure. And so I want to ask you two questions. The first of which we already asked is, what would you do for real treasure? What thing would you not give up for that real treasure? And then you get an answer of what you should do next. That's the thing that needs to go. And then the last question we need to ask is, do you understand all these things? Now remember that Jesus, we've talked about explanations here and different things like that. Jesus doesn't give them this. He just tells them these parables and says, do you get it? Yeah, we get it. Okay, good. Now what? And we do something about it. And then he starts to talk about some other parables. So let's go over into Matthew 21 and verses 33 through 35. Jesus has just taught us in those couple of parables how to recognize the kingdom. It's a treasure in a field, and you'll notice it when you see it, especially if you're looking for it. But if you're aware of things that are valuable, even when you stumble across something, you think of, there's different antique sales and stores and things like that, and when you really stumble across that thing, you kind of have to know what to look for, or else it's just, a teacup or whatever. And so you need to know what you're looking for, and that's what Jesus is teaching in parables like this, and we'll call them the wisdom parables. What to look for. Do you understand this? And then he'll start to say, okay, if you recognize this and you understand this and you've become a disciple of the kingdom, now we need to anticipate. And he starts to teach a lot of worker parables. There's a whole lot, and they all got the same general idea. And the one that we'll speak on for our purposes is in Matthew 21 and verse 33. And there's some very interesting and kind of like paradoxical and nonsensical things here too. So Matthew 21 in verse 33. Let's go ahead and we'll read through the whole section here down to verse 44. So verse 33, it says, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a wine press in it and, built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. When the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. The vine growers took his slaves and beat one and killed another and stoned the third. Again, he sent another group of slaves, larger than the first, and they did the same thing to them. But afterward, he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' And when the vine growers saw his son, they said among themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance.' They took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do with these vine growers?" And you stop there for a second. That's a good question for us to look at. What do you think that Dad's going to do with the people who killed his son? They have an answer, and I think it's a good one. Verse 41, they say to him, "He will bring those wretches to a wretched end and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at proper seasons." In other words, they're going to get justice. And so Jesus looks at this answer and he goes, that seems like a fair thing. I mean, they killed his own son after all. So this seems fair. So Jesus says to them, "Did you never read the scriptures? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes." He asks them, "Haven't you ever read that? Therefore I say to you," he says, "the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." Now here's the first thing, the first application for this. Remember that these parables, all the ones that we've spoken of already and will continue to speak of later today, these are all given especially to a people at a certain time. You and I will learn a secondary lesson from this, which is important, but Jesus is especially talking to the Jews living then in his lifetime. So let's go back through that parable and notice a few things. First of all, this parable is not just some really kind of cool idea that Jesus has crafted out of nowhere. This is a quote from Isaiah chapter 5. Right there in the first verse, in verse 33, some of your Bibles might format it this way. Mine does, where it will capitalize words or phrases that are in quotes that come from other places. And so you can look, if you've got a footnote there in your Bibles, it will have a cross-reference back to this. If you want to take a look at Isaiah 5, you'll see it there. Jesus brings up this idea about a man, a master, who planted a vineyard, put a wall around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. All the things you need to have a good vineyard. He gave everything that was necessary. So what he just needs now is people to work the land. So as he has people come in and work the land, they take what was not theirs. They were stewards of it. They make themselves the landowners, and then they do with it how they see fit. Now, as Jesus brings out this parable, those scribes of the kingdom, those people who were familiar with Isaiah, should have been, okay, he's talking about Israel. He's talking about us. But they forgot that because Jesus says down there in verse 42, you forgot. You've never read these scriptures, have you? So he's calling them out here as he goes through these first few verses. The vine growers then, you saw there, have a mutiny against the owner, and then they kill the son. And then they, in justice, are replaced. So this is what happens when people don't anticipate the kingdom of heaven. In the kingdom, there are two types of people. There are slaves and there are stewards. And then within that subset of stewards, there are good stewards and bad stewards. That is to say that a steward is someone who is in charge of things that he does not possess. So if you've ever been babysat or had a babysitter, that person is a steward of your children. A bank is a steward of your money, and so on and so forth. These are people who don't actually own the stuff that's with them, but they are in charge of it and in charge to keep it safe and even make a profit with it. And so there are those, but then there are also slaves. Now, when Jesus is talking about these slaves that come in to help get the produce so that they can take it to market and make a profit, Jesus is talking about the prophets spelled differently. He's talking about those like Isaiah that we talked about last night, and Jeremiah and Malachi and Hosea and Zechariah and all these others who came to talk about the kingdom of heaven. And the stewards who had become sour here, they rejected all of these. They heard the message of the kingdom and didn't want it. And so the king, the master, kept sending servants after servants, and more than in the last times than in the first. And they rejected him and rejected him and rejected him until that time came when he said, you know what? I'll send my son. Now notice what happens when these stewards here see the son. Here's the crazy thing. This sounds like it makes more sense here when we read it in English and what we think of typically as an inheritance, but this is completely just insane if you're talking about this from a Jewish perspective of inheritance. In verse 38, it says that they see the son, they say, this is the heir, come let us kill him and seize his inheritance. Now, remember what a Jewish inheritance looks like. It's not only like the stuff that dad would leave in his will for you when he died, but it's land. Like the land is wrapped up in your family line. And if you don't have a father, or if you were married in and your husband died and you didn't have anyone else to take care of you, you had nothing. No land, nothing. But it's even more than that. It's not just the land that comes through the family line. It is the family line itself. It's the last name. It's the surname, if we could use that kind of idea. The inheritance is everything that comes from you being a member of that family, both the material and the ideological. And so what they're saying here is, here's the son. We're going to kill him and sneak our way into the guy's family. And we're going to take his stuff and we're going to put his name on us and we're going to fake it like we are the king's real sons. Then we deserve this vineyard. And so they try to make themselves kings. Now I want to bring in the two ideas that we've talked about so far with the wisdom parables and now these worker parables, is that the people who come into the kingdom of heaven are those who count all things as loss. They do not take anything, but they give it away. And then that great pearl is given to them. These people here try to take it by force. They try to take the kingdom by force, and it will not work. And so here's the lesson for us then, or rather a question that we should ask, is what happens when people don't anticipate the kingdom? In other words, the people who don't anticipate the kingdom are those who don't wait for it, those who don't work in it and produce a profit for the master. They are those who try to steal it. I think of this, I've seen a few train tracks as we've been driving by, and we've had some trains out on the coast as well in California. And you know when those things are moving. In fact, there's one that's several miles away from where we live, but at nighttime we can hear it as it goes by. We can hear the horns and everything. I know you can too, depending on how far it is. And you know when those things are coming. And if you're close to it, it's just and the ground's shaking and everything. And of course, you're familiar as well with, maybe you've done this as a kid, or maybe you've seen this in the movies too, where kids are playing on the tracks and putting pennies on the tracks. And I remember that movie Pollyanna, where that kid puts a chain on the track and watches it get flattened when the train comes by. The train is a dangerous thing if you're not aware of it and you're not ready for it. And so kids, when they don't anticipate the train, are doing all sorts of goofy things, insane things, like laying their heads down on the tracks and laughing and things like that. And it's like, if you don't know that the train is coming and aren't listening for the train, that's a death sentence. Now, over in California, there's another little train. We call it the Sprinter. It's a little commuter thing to take people from city to city to get to work. And I hear about once a month somebody's died by being hit by that thing. And you don't know, sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's a complete accident. And this is what happens when people don't anticipate something coming. Now think about that train for a second. For some people, it's the lifeblood of their life, right? They can't afford to pay registration for a car, different things like that, and the train fare is cheap and it gets them to work and it gets them back home. It is what keeps them alive, in a sense of speaking. But for others, it means death. Those who aren't looking out for it and watching when the crossbars come down. The kingdom of heaven is very similar. It is a powerful force, and it's something that cannot be overcome. It overthrows all oppressors. And if we're not looking out for it, it's going to run us down. But if you and I are ready for it, it's salvation. It's the lifeline. It's where the Christ is. And so the question then is, what happens when we don't anticipate the kingdom of heaven? Let's put this another way now. What happens if we do? If we do anticipate the kingdom of heaven, we start working. We start being active and being involved, and not only working with our hands, but the development of our minds as well. And we start to study more and then apply those things. Remember when Jesus asked, do you understand all of this? Yes, I've worked a lot to try and understand that. Well, what are you doing about it? Understanding of ideas, information presented to me requires a verdict that then I make a decision on how I live my life. Those who anticipate think and act entirely differently. I want to ask you that question again. Do you understand all these things? Look in Psalm 90. This is a favorite psalm of mine to talk about this idea. Psalm 90, and we'll start in verse 11. A worker in the kingdom, or at Jesus' time, a worker anticipating the coming of the kingdom. Remember when Jesus had taught people to pray, he had told them to pray, your kingdom come. And that time was very soon. And so these people here, or secondarily for us now, the same remains true in this, that it is a sad thing for those who don't anticipate the kingdom, especially for those who already live in it. And so Psalm 90 presents this idea this way. Psalm 90, and starting in verse 11, we get to see kind of talk about the kingdom as it relates to its master, to God in heaven. And it says, who understands the power of your anger and your fury, according to the fear that is due you? God is like that train that we had spoken of. The scripture describes him, like we read last night in Hebrews, as an all-consuming fire. He's not someone to be trifled with. And so we're told here, who can understand that greatness of your anger and your fury? So do something for us, he pleads with God. Teach us to number our days so that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. Do return, O Lord. How long will it be? And be sorry for your servants. Oh, satisfy us in the morning of your loving kindness or your loyal faithfulness. He says that we may sing for joy and be glad in all our days. Make us glad according to the days you have afflicted us and the years we have seen evil. Let your work appear to your servants and your majesty to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, confirm for us the work of our hands. What the psalmist is asking here is to teach us what sort of things we need to lose. You see that there in verse 12. Teach us to number our days. There's a song that I remember as a kid. It was a country song. It was Live Like You Were Dying. I can't remember who the singer of that was, but that was a neat idea there, is to live like you were dying. But even still, I think it falls just a little bit short, so we're going to tweak it. For instance, if you live like you were dying, and the song kind of goes like, I had cancer or something like that, and I was looking forward to this, and then I started to think about better things and more important things in life with the time that I had left, and so I started talking with my kids more, and I went and rode a roller coaster and all these different things. But I think what we're talking about here when we're considering giving up these things for the treasure and selling all things is to live as if you were dead already. I think sometimes, and people have done this in different places with different mediums of art, is that if you could walk around and look above each person's head and there would be like a little countdown timer, right? And kind of like that song, you get to see maybe how many years they have left, decades, or maybe just months or a week or hours or moments. It might give you a different perspective on how you talk and interact with that person. And what sort of things, like if this person had a week left, you wouldn't be talking about the weather. You'd be talking about something else. But the timer that I think we're getting ready to see here to teach us to number our days is a timer that's just always 1, 0, 1, 0. It's always dead. It always has lost everything. And in that always dying, they've gained back everything. They've lost their life to gain it. They've sold everything to find it. And that's what Jesus is trying to prep us for in these parables. A worker in the kingdom is an anticipator of the kingdom, someone who's waiting for it, someone who's already dead, and so they live every moment as if it were here. Same is true for the Jews listening to this at Jesus' time. Same is true for us, that it's already here. I want to finish up with one more type of parable, and this is the wedding parables. There's a few of these, and they start to pop up a lot around Matthew chapter 24. So let's go over there, Matthew 24, and verses 45 and on. We'll read a parable right before the kind of the main wedding parable, and you'll see the tie-in here together. One of the things that I like to remember is that Jesus talks obviously with a lot of people, thousands upon thousands of people. And I'm sure that there are many times when he would bring up the same idea that maybe he'd mentioned in Capernaum, he'd mentioned that same idea in Jerusalem again. There's a lot of teachings I'm sure that Jesus had reused to present to a new group of people. Some he didn't, we're told that expressly, but there are some I'm sure that we did. And so he brings out another parable here in Matthew 24, which is very similar to something that we just read. And so let's start with that and use it as our tie-in. Verse 45 of chapter 24, he says, "Who then is a faithful," or loyal, right? That's the idea there, "and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time," just like those stewards in the vineyard. Who is the faithful slave who he puts in charge? It's even a little more so here in verse 45, is that this master has charged this sensible and faithful slave to be his kid's babysitter. That's what this means, to be in charge of his household and to give them their food at the proper time. This is going to be funny because Paige, when we get back home, Paige is getting ready to go and visit some friends for a few days, and so I'm left with Deacon for a few days, and it's not just been me and Deacon before, so I'm a little freaked out. I'm like, when does he eat? What does he eat? All these different things, and I need to be a good and faithful servant for this. And so he has been charged with this guy's kids, his whole household. And in verse 46, we're told what the faithful, loyal slave looks like. He's the one who is happy, he says, is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. I imagine that the master opens the door like, "Hey, are you still here?" And he's like feeding his kids food, right? Like, "Okay, I was doing this the whole time. This is what I was doing." And so that's the happy slave who, whenever the master shows up, he's been working the whole time, feeding his kids, passing out treasures old and new. He's been spending all of his time doing these things. In verse 47, he says, "Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master's not coming for a long time,' and begins to beat his fellow slaves and eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour which he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites." So that word there could also be translated as the pretenders. In that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This person is a pretender because he says, "I don't know when the master's coming back. I'm just going to have fun now." And, it goes in the master's pantry and is like, "Wow, look at all this good stuff." And he just starts eating whatever he can find. And he says, "You know what? I'll clean it all up when the master gets home." And then the master shows up unexpectedly. And he was planning to go when the master came back. "Oh, yeah," and, feeding the kid, and the kid hasn't eaten in several days. "Yeah, I've been doing this the whole time." That's the evil slave, he says, the one who wasn't waiting, but was pretending the whole time. Now look at chapter 25 and verse 1. He transitions, but it's the same idea. We're still talking about the kingdom of heaven. We're still talking about anticipating, but now we're taking it one step further. So we've talked about how to recognize the kingdom with the wisdom parables. We've talked about how to anticipate it with the worker parables. Now we move into a wedding parable to prepare for it. We take that anticipation, that waiting and expectancy, and now we do something with it. And you see that really come out here in chapter 25. It says, "The kingdom of heaven will be comparable to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were prudent. And when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the prudent took oil in flasks along with their lamps. Now, while the bridegroom was delaying, they all got drowsy and began to sleep. But at midnight there was a shout, 'Behold, the bridegroom! Come out to meet him!' Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' And the prudent answered, 'No, there will not be enough for us and you too. Go instead to the dealers and buy some for yourselves.' And while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were already went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. Later the other virgins also came, saying, 'Lord, Lord, open up for us.' But he answered, 'Truly I say to you, I do not know you.'" Jesus concludes with verse 13. "Be on the alert then, for you do not know that day nor the hour." Jewish weddings are very different than ours, and probably only the thing that's analogous to, our typical American type wedding is the bridesmaids, right? That's about as close as you're going to get to it being just really comparable together. And so they're waiting for the bridegroom to come through town in kind of like a parade, and they're going to bring him into this place where they'll have this wedding feast, and this will typically happen at night. The ceremonies and all these different things take all day long, and so you're traveling at night, and so the people who belong there are going to be the ones that carry torches and lamps. People who don't have torches and lamps with them, weren't thinking about this, they're wedding crashers. You need to get away from them. So we think of wedding crashers as somebody who's just going to come and eat your cake. These people will come and steal your stuff, and they'll come kill family members, and they'll come take your wife. So you need to be really careful about who's who. So as they're waiting for this, there are people who are here that we know the wedding, we got the invitation, we're ready to go with our stuff. But it says that there's foolish ones and prudent ones. So they're all getting ready for the big day, but what's the problem? And why are some foolish and some prudent? You know the answer to this. They recognize the event, they know it's important, they've dressed up for it, and they've got the stuff ready. So all of them are anticipating and recognize what's going on. So with that though, although they anticipate, the problem is that for 5 of them, their actions didn't align with their intentions. They had the lamp, they were ready to go, they wanted to be there. Why didn't they bring more oil? Now, if this was really important to you, you'd remember to bring oil. And you'd ask them, I'm sure, and you'd say, wasn't this important to you? And yeah, look at us, we're ready to go. But their actions didn't fully line up with what they were thinking. And the scripture describes this in a phrase, it uses the words double-mindedness, in that they had an idea of where they wanted to go, and the things that they were doing didn't match up with it, even though that's what they wanted. So Jesus shows prudence versus foolishness in not only recognizing the wedding, anticipating the bridegroom coming, but also being fully active and ready and having your actions align with what you think. Being consistent. So let's go and look at another place here in James chapter 1 and verse 8. James chapter 1 and verse 8. When I was in Boy Scouts, the Boy Scout motto is be prepared, and I took that really seriously. And not all the boys in the troop did, and I'm not saying this to be like I was better than them or whatever, because there was kind of a weird satisfaction of like when they weren't ready for stuff, I was like, I got it right here. And everybody's like, David, you're the man. And I was like, yeah. And so it wasn't like, these bums or whatever. It was fun for us to work and interact that way. And so I took this very seriously, and sometimes it was a little over the top, and sometimes I would have my huge backpack and we'd go on this hiking trip sort of thing, and I'd get overheated when I didn't need to bring all of that stuff. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword for that application. But I remember there was this one trip that we went to, it was called a Klondike, and several different Boy Scout troops from around the area, we'd all meet together, and it was a cold weather activities weekend. And so there's competitions and different things like that. One of those is that the boys would be strapped into a dog sled and would drag it around like dogs. And so you're doing that in the snow. And one of the things that we had to do when we first showed up was build the shelter that we were going to sleep in for the whole weekend. And my scoutmaster's kind of a little bit late for everything, and we showed up very late for this, and it had started snowing a lot. We were showing up as the sun was going down. And we've got 15 boys in our troop, and we've got to make a shelter that can fit all of them in it. And so I'm freaking out. I was the leader at that point in time in the troop, the boy leader, right? We had the scoutmaster that was above that. And so I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, all I've ever stayed in was a tent before. And so what I did was like, we're running out of time. Everybody's got their cool igloos and everything. We got to do something fast. So we're just going to dig a pit in here, and then we're going to cover it with some tarps and put some shovels underneath to stop the snow, because it's really starting to come in. Eventually, over the course of that night, that was the biggest snowstorm we'd had in 15 years in that area. Several feet worth of snow. And I was thinking, this will be a good idea, right? We've got good solid walls. We don't have to like construct bricks and put them up. This was like the worst idea you could ever have. Like, never ever do any of what I just said, because what happens is, you're familiar with this, you've got a basement, the cold air goes down. And we were down in the pit, and everybody in the igloos had benches that they were sleeping up on over. And so they were warm and great, and it got really scary for a bit. We had kind of almost like a root cellar type door with tarps, right? So kind of angled at the sides so that we could get in and out. And the snow kept coming, and the snow kept coming, and it buried us. And I remember waking up with a drip on my nose. And the tarp, which was well over an arm's length on top of me, was right here. And I was looking around to try and find where the shovel was, and the shovel was still there, but the tarp had like come down around it. And I tried to push up on the snow, and it wouldn't give. There were pounds upon pounds of snow in there. And we're sitting in there, and we have like a few tea candles, and so we start lighting them and trying to figure out like what we're gonna do. And we can't even like scoot around inside this thing because we weren't recognizing where we were actually at. And we weren't ready for everything, even though that was the scout motto, be prepared. And I had a lot of spare socks and stuff in my bag, and there were some kids there that just brought like some Nike gym socks. And so we were trying to spread those things out and get those going, and kids were starting to slip into hypothermia, and we were really worried about stuff. And we finally dug out in the morning and got one of the kids in the car, and we had to keep the car running for most of the day to get him all warmed up. And it was a scary thing. And so I'm sure you're familiar with that too, with the snow that comes, and sometimes things can get really scary with that. This is what happens when you don't prepare. You weren't there early enough. We weren't ready for what we were getting into. We were just like, yeah, we can show up and just do this thing. And it doesn't work that way. We didn't recognize it. We didn't anticipate. We didn't prepare. And it almost cost dearly. How much more so concerning the kingdom of heaven? We're not just talking about a few boys on a camping trip. We're talking about eternity. We're talking about everything. And so when we're talking about this wedding feast in this parable, it is so important that our actions line up with our intentions. You're a Boy Scout? Yeah. What's the motto? Be prepared, we all yell. But we didn't match that up. This is very important. James chapter 1 tells us that there is a double-minded man. He's talking about praying and meaning what you're praying for and knowing that God can give it. But here he drops this universal truth. And what I mean by that is that there are things that when applied in context are true, but if you take it out of their context, it doesn't mean anything. And that's when people say, you can prove anything with the Bible. Yeah, if you just take stuff out of context and mess it around with it. These are one of those things where you can take this out of this verse and you can put it any single place and it will always be true no matter what context. That is that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. A person who has intentions, but their actions are not consistent with those, is unstable, like a house built on sand. On the other hand, there's great confidence that comes from recognizing and anticipating and preparing for the kingdom in faith. When I was going on camping trips where I was in my element and I had all my things and everything that I could have possibly needed was there, there's a confidence that comes with that. There are things that I know can be handled this way. Let's go back through the whole lesson as we start kind of over. We talked about the wisdom parables, recognizing the kingdom. And Jesus asked, do you understand all these things? Does this make sense to you? If so, and your actions align with your intentions, you're going to sell everything. But you're going to gain the world back. Do you work as if the master is coming right away? Because the scripture says that although the kingdom is already established, the master is coming again to claim his redeemed. Are you anticipating that? In these parables, Jesus is talking about the time when the kingdom was first going to be established, but he is coming again. Are you anticipating that? Now, here's a way that you can know that for sure. You can ask yourself, could I say with all honesty and great hope and joy, could I ask and beg for Christ to come again today? Because sometimes when I ask myself that question, I go, oh, there's a couple other things I'd like to do. And that means I haven't given everything up yet. I think sometimes, I'd like to grow old and I'd like to, be like a grandfather to my grandkids like my grandpa was to me and provide things, old and new. And when I answer the question that way, I'm told by myself and God exactly what needs to go. My hopes for things in this life, my anticipation for the temporal stuff, that's exactly the thing that needs to be sold. So when we anticipate the kingdom and work hard for that, we look to that and then we prepare for it in the full sense of speaking. That by acting in trust, in faith, all of our lives are given up to look for the kingdom of heaven and to be ready for it when the king comes in his beauty. We're going to offer an invitation here as we get ready to move even into our next lesson. Have you recognized those things that are in your life that need to be sold? And this takes some good and honest looking at yourself, and that's not always fun. In fact, it's often the opposite. but it's a wonderful thing to consider what needs to be sold so that all things can be gained. If you've not made that decision today, if you've not sold everything that you have, if you've not decided that your life is loss for the gain of the knowledge of Christ, you can make that decision this morning. You can obey the gospel and start that journey with him in the kingdom and in faith through baptism. If you'd like to do that, you can do so this morning. Let's stand and sing a song to consider these things and think about it.
317.